They told her a woman had no business finishing a man's survey, and then they sent her up the pass alone in October, with a storm already gray on the western teeth of the range. The superintendent did not even rise from his chair when he said it. He slid the leather satchel of her father's field notes across the desk toward her, 2 fingers on the corner, the way a man pushes away a plate he is done with. "Take the instrument back up if you must," Harlan Voss said. "Walk the line your father couldn't finish. Bring me a closed traverse by the first snowfall, Miss Hartwell, and the Cascade and Northern Railway will pay the Hartwell name what it's owed. Fail, and the contract goes to men who can." He smiled when he said men who can. Behind her, 3 surveyors at the long table laughed without looking up from their coffee. One of them, a thick-shouldered chief of party named Bram Teller, said it loud enough to carry. "Send the seamstress to read the angles. That ought to close a traverse." And the room laughed again, easy and certain, the laugh of men who have never once been wrong out loud. Adeline Hartwell did not laugh. She did not argue. She picked up the satchel, and under it, in its scarred walnut case with the brass corners worn bright by her father's hands, she lifted the surveyor's transit, the heavy brass instrument he had carried into these mountains for 19 years, and she settled the leather strap of it across her shoulder, the way another woman might settle a sleeping child. She felt the weight of it ride against her hip, familiar as her own heartbeat. She was 26 years old. She had drawn every clean line on every map that had made Harlan Voss his money for the last 6 years, hunched over her father's drafting table by lamplight, while the world assumed the old man's steady hand had done it. And now the old man's hand was in the ground, and the world had decided his daughter was a seamstress. The barometer on Voss's wall had been falling since dawn. She had watched the little needle slide while he talked, a slow fall only she seemed able to see. The pressure was dropping faster than weather that meant rain. She knew that drop. Her father had taught her that drop on a ridge above the tree line when she was 9, his cold hand over hers on the brass case, his voice low. A falling glass like that, Della, and you get off the high ground. You do not argue with it. You go down. She looked at the men laughing into their coffee, and she understood, with a calm that surprised her, that none of them would last a night where she was going. And she understood, too, that the storm she could read on the glass was already 3 days closer than the storm Harlan Voss thought he was sending her into. That was the thing none of them knew yet. That was the thing the mountain was about to teach the man who scarred his own face years ago, and swore he would never owe another living soul a single thing again. The Hartwell survey had a name in the valley before Adeline ever carried the transit out of town. Folks called her father the man who could see through rock. Thomas Hartwell had walked timber cruises and rail lines and mining claims across the northern range for 19 years, and the railroad men trusted his numbers like they trusted sunrise, because his numbers had never once put a grade where a grade could not go. What none of those men ever asked was who inked his field books fair each night, who reduced his angles by lamplight, who caught the small arithmetic slips a tired man makes at altitude before they ever reached a railroad desk. They never asked because the answer would have embarrassed them. The answer was a girl, and then a young woman, with her father's same gray eyes and her father's same stubborn patience, working at a second table he had built for her in the corner of the cabin. So she would always have a place to put her elbows and her mind. And if some part of you has ever been the one in the corner, the one doing the careful work nobody thought to credit, the one a room full of louder people decided was a seamstress when you knew exactly what you were, then stay up here with me and subscribe, because that quiet, overlooked, finally proven person is the only kind of soul I tell stories about on this channel. And you already belong with them. Thomas had wanted a son to carry the trade. He got Adeline instead, and after her mother died of the fever the winter Della turned 10, he stopped pretending the want mattered. He taught her everything. He taught her to set the transit dead level over a hub so the bubble sat still as oil. He taught her to read a vernier to the half-minute in failing light. He taught her the long, patient discipline of a closed traverse, that you walk a line of stations out across broken country, measuring every angle and every distance. And if your work is honest, when you come back around to where you began, the line closes on itself with no gap, and that gap, or the lack of it, is the whole confession of whether a man's work can be believed. He taught her chains and stadia and the slow mathematics of bringing a wild slope down onto a flat sheet of paper. And he taught her the mountains themselves, which clouds carried snow and which carried only show. How a creek talks different the night before a freeze. Why you never make camp in the soft, pretty bottom of a draw, where the cold pools like water. She was better than he was at the end. They both knew it and neither said it, because saying it would have meant saying out loud what would happen to a woman who tried to do it for pay. The Cascade and Northern Railway had hired Thomas Hartwell to run the final survey through the high pass that would carry their line over the divide. The contract that would set the Hartwells up for good, the one he had chased his whole life. He had gotten 2/3 of the traverse closed when his heart quit on the trail in August, between Station 40 and Station 41, with the transit set up over the hub and the bubble still level, as if even his body had wanted to finish the shot. Adeline had brought him down the mountain on a borrowed mule. She had also, before she left that camp, taken the last reading he would never take, and written it in his field book in a hand, so like his own, that no one alive could have told them apart. So when Harlan Voss told her a woman had no business finishing a man's survey, Adeline Hartwell knew something he did not. She knew the survey was already 3/4 hers. She had a contract clause her father had insisted on, in writing, that the Hartwell estate would be paid in full upon delivery of a closed and proven traverse through the pass. And she had a father in the ground who had spent his last summer telling her, over and over, that the route everyone assumed went through Voss's preferred notch was wrong, that the grade there was a hair too steep, and the avalanche track above it would bury a train every third winter. Thomas had found a second way, a longer, lower line around the shoulder of the mountain the trappers called the Widow, a line no one had surveyed because no one but a few furmen ever went there. He had run the first stations of it in secret, off the company's chosen route, because he knew if he was right, it would save the railroad a fortune, and save the men who would one day ride that line their lives. He had not lived to prove it. The proof was in the unclosed traverse, waiting up the pass, in the cold, where the storm was already coming down. The trailhead was 4 hours' ride from town, and Adeline rode it alone on her father's roan gelding, with the transit in its case lashed behind the cantle, and the falling glass riding worse with every mile. By the time the timber closed over the trail, the sky had gone the color of an old bruise, green-yellow at the edges, and the wind had begun to come down slope in long, cold pulls that smelled of stone and the high snowfields. She knew the smell. It was the smell of a storm that had already made up its mind. A sensible person would have turned the roan around. But a sensible person had not buried her father in August and stood in a land office in October while 3 men laughed her name down to seamstress, and Adeline had passed sensible a long way back down the trail. She put her collar up and rode on into the country where the only man for 30 miles was a scarred trapper who had not spoken a full sentence to another human being in the better part of 2 years, and who was, at that very hour, reading the same falling glass off the same gray sky, and cursing whatever fool was on his mountain. His name was Wesley Crane, and the valley, on the rare occasions it spoke of him at all, called him the Burnt Man. He had a cabin of squared timber on the bench above Cutthroat Creek, 2 days' fur line in either direction, and a heavy gray dog named Job that had appointed itself his conscience. The left side of Wesley's face was seamed and shining from the jaw to the temple, where a powder flash and a winter without a doctor had healed him, crooked, and he had long ago stopped flinching at the way strangers looked at him, mostly by arranging never to be looked at. He came to town twice a year to sell pelts and buy powder and salt, and he paid in silence and left in silence, and the only living things that did not seem to find him fearsome were his dog and the mountain itself. He had built his life around a single hard article of faith, learned the worst way a man can learn it, that to need another person was to hand them a knife and turn your back. He had decided he would not be that kind of fool again. He would owe nothing and be owed nothing, and that, he had told himself for 2 years, was as close to peace as a man like him was going to get. Job heard her first. The big dog came up off the cabin floor with a low rumble in his chest and stood at the door, one ear cocked toward the trail, and Wesley, mending a snowshoe by the fire, knew that sound. It was not the sound the dog made for elk or for a wandering trapper. It was the sound he made for trouble that did not know it was trouble yet. Wesley went to the window. Through the first thin streamers of snow, he watched a rider come up out of the timber on a tired roan, sitting the saddle straight-backed and stubborn, and behind the cantle, lashed and canvas-wrapped against the weather, the unmistakable long shape of a surveyor's instrument in its case. He swore, once, quietly. He had seen what the high country did to men who came up it with instruments and certainty and no respect for the glass. He had buried 2 of them, years apart, with his own hands. And now the glass was falling off the bottom of the world, and there was a greenhorn on his mountain with a brass machine, and the worst storm in a decade about to come down on both of them, and Wesley Crane, who had sworn to owe nothing to anyone ever again, felt the old debt the mountain levies on every man who can help and chooses not to settle cold in his gut. He almost let her ride past. That is the truth of it, and he would tell her so himself much later, on a night when the truth had finally become a thing he could afford. He stood at the window with his hand on the cold doorframe, and he told himself she was not his to save, that he had a rule, that the rule had kept him alive and unbroken for 2 hard years. And then the wind shifted and brought the storm's full breath down the slope, a wall of cold that bent the smoke flat over his own roof. And he saw the roan flinch and the rider haul its head around toward the only shelter in 30 miles, which was his, and Wesley took his coat off the peg. He pulled the door open against the wind, and he stepped out into the first hard snow to flag down the fool on the roan before the mountain took her, his face turned out of an old habit, so the burnt side was away. She saw the cabin and the smoke and the big dog before she saw the man, and then she saw the man, and she did not flinch, which Wesley noticed, because everyone flinched. She saw only that he had a roof and a fire and the bearing of someone who knew the country, and she was a surveyor's daughter who had been taught that pride is a poor thing to freeze to death holding. "My horse is done, and the glass has been falling since dawn," she called down over the wind, and Wesley stopped where he stood, because that was not what a greenhorn said. A greenhorn talked about how cold it was. This one had read the barometer. "There's a lean-to on the south wall," he said, the most words he had given a stranger in a year. "Put the horse up and come in before it closes. It's going to close hard." She swung down stiff from the cold, and when she went to lift the canvas-wrapped instrument off the saddle, he saw her take the whole weight of it without a grunt, settle the strap across her shoulder, and carry it like it was a part of her body. He had been wrong about her in one particular already, and Wesley Crane was a man who kept a hard private ledger of when he had been wrong. He filed it. Then the snow came down in earnest, and the talking stopped, because there was wood to bring in and a storm to survive. The first night, the storm sat down on the mountain like something with weight, and the cabin became the whole world. Adeline sat on the far side of the fire with her father's transit case at her feet where she could touch it, and watched the man move through the small economy of his survival, feeding the fire in measured pieces, hanging her wet coat where it would dry but not scorch, setting a pot of beans and salt pork at the coals without once asking her whether she was hungry, because of course she was hungry. Everyone coming off that trail was hungry, and asking would only have made her account for a need. She understood the grammar of it because it was her father's grammar. Care delivered as logistics. Kindness with the sentiment filed off so a proud person could accept it without choking. She had grown up inside that grammar, and she knew, watching this scarred, silent man speak it fluently to a stranger he plainly resented saving, that whatever the valley said about the burnt man, the valley had never sat at his fire. She watched him work, and she cataloged him with the same care her father had taught her to spend on a slope before he trusted his weight to it. He banked the fire so it would hold through the night without waking him. He had a place for everything in the small cabin, and everything was in its place. The order of a man who has learned that disorder gets people killed. There was a second tin cup on the shelf, dented, unused, and she understood without being told that it had been Margaret's, though she did not know the name yet, and that he had kept it through 2 years of needing nothing. When the beans were hot, he filled a plate and set it down on the floor beside her, not handing it to her, never handing, because handing required a thank you, and a thank you was a small debt, and the man would not be owed even that. She ate. It was good. Plain food, salt and fat, and the particular sweetness of beans cooked slow. And she had not eaten since the dark hours before the land office, and she felt the warmth of it move down into her like the first kind thing the day had done. "It's good," she said anyway, because she had been raised to say it, and Wesley grunted and turned his ruined face toward the fire, and she saw the thank you land on him like a stone he did not know where to set down. He gave her the bunk and took the floor by the door with the dog, and she argued once, and he ended it with 4 words. "It's my house. Sleep." So she slept, or tried to, in a stranger's bed in a stranger's cabin with a killing storm leaning on the walls, and she lay awake a long while listening to the man breathe by the door, even and slow and never quite all the way down into sleep, a watchkeeper's breathing, and she understood that he was awake too, keeping the kind of watch a man keeps when he has decided to be responsible for a life he never asked for. Safety, she would think later, was the only language Wesley Crane spoke without an accent. He could not say a tender word to save his life, but he could keep the cold out and the fire in and the watch all night, and after a while she learned to hear all the things he could not say in the steady sound of him not sleeping. And it was, she found, more than most men ever managed to say with all their words. "You'll want to know why I'm up here," she said into the silence, because the silence had begun to ask the question for her. He did not look up from the fire. "Your business is your business. It's the Cascade and Northern Survey. Through the pass." That made him look up. "Your father's survey," he said. It was not a question. She went still. "You knew my father." Thomas Hartwell ran a line past my creek 2 summers back, set his instrument up on my woodpile to get above the brush, and asked first, which is more than most. A long pause, and then, lower, the nearest thing to gentleness she would get from him for days. "I'd heard he passed." He was a careful man. Careful. Out of this man's mouth, with the wind screaming at the chinking, she understood it was the highest word he owned. "I'm finishing it," she said. "The traverse. The last third." And Wesley Crane looked at the slim young woman across his fire and at the heavy brass instrument she guarded with her feet. And he said the thing the whole valley would have said, the thing Harlan Voss had said, the thing she had ridden 4 hours into a killing storm specifically to stop hearing. Alone. In this? That's not survey work. That's a way to die on a mountain and leave a machine to rust. She did not flinch at that either. She only reached down, unlatched the scarred walnut case, and turned the transit so the firelight ran along the worn brass. "Then, it's a good thing," she said, "that I was raised by the most careful man you ever called careful." And for the first time in 2 years, Wesley Crane felt something in his chest that was dangerously close to wanting to know how a story ended. The storm did not lift the next day, or the day after that. The snow came down in a silence so total, it had a sound of its own, and the drifts climbed the north wall of the cabin, foot by foot, and the world narrowed to firelight, and the smell of wood smoke, and wet wool, and the slow, careful business of 2 guarded people, learning the shape of each other across a small, warm room. Wesley did not soften. He kept his face turned and his words counted. But he watched her like a man watches weather. And what he saw kept contradicting what he had filed. She did not whine. She did not weep over her dead father where he could see, though once, in the deep of the second night, he woke to the small sound of her grief and lay still in the dark and let her have it private, which was its own kind of mercy. By day she worked. She had brought her father's field books and his unclosed traverse, and she spread them on the floor by the fire and worked through his stations one by one, reducing his angles, checking his distances, her lips moving over the arithmetic. And Wesley, who could not read a vernier from a rifle sight, understood enough to see that the slim seamstress the town had laughed at was doing mathematics in her head, in the firelight, that the men in town could not have done with a clear desk in a week. He did not understand the work, but he understood concentration, and he understood the particular fierceness of a person doing a thing they have been told they cannot do. And he found, to his own irritation, that he could not stop watching her do it. Once he set a cup of tea down by her elbow, and she did not even see it for an hour, lost in a column of figures, and when she finally surfaced and found it gone cold, she looked up at him with such naked surprise that someone had thought of her at all that he had to turn away. He had spent 2 years certain that letting another person into the small circle of his fire would cost him something he could not afford to lose again. He had not considered the other possibility, the one she was demonstrating without meaning to across his cabin floor. That the right person did not take from the circle but widened it. It frightened him more than the storm. The storm he knew how to survive. They did not speak much those days, but the silence had changed its quality. It was not the silence of 2 strangers waiting out a storm anymore. It was the silence of 2 people who had begun, without permission, to trust the sound of each other breathing in a small, warm room. On the 3rd day she found the error, and it changed everything, though neither of them knew yet how much. She had been reducing her father's notes from the disputed notch, Voss's chosen route, the line the railroad had assumed for years, and the numbers would not behave. The grade through the notch came out steeper than the field book claimed, steep enough that no locomotive built could pull a loaded train up it without a second engine and a prayer. She checked it 3 times. Then she understood, and she sat back on her heels by the fire, with her father's book open on her knee and her hand pressed flat to her mouth. because she understood not only that the notch route was wrong, but that her father had known it was wrong and had said so, and had been told by Harlan Voss to survey it anyway and shade the numbers to make the grade look workable. There it was in his hand, a note in the margin she had read 100 times and never understood until she stood inside the country it described. They want the notch. The notch will bury a train every third winter. I will give them the widow, or I will give them nothing. The longer line her father had been running in secret, the lower way around the shoulder of the mountain, the route that would cost the railroad more in track and save them everything in lives. He had died with it 2/3 proven, and Harlan Voss had sent the careful man's daughter up the pass alone in a storm, not to finish the honest survey, but she saw now with a cold clarity that had nothing to do with the weather, to fail at it, so the contract and the inconvenient truth could both be buried with the Hartwell name. If you've made it this far into Adeline's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. She read the margin note aloud, her voice steady, and Wesley Crane set down the snowshoe he was mending and listened to a dead man accuse the living, and something in the scarred man went very still and very dangerous, because if there was one thing Wesley understood in his bones, it was a powerful man deciding a smaller person was expendable. He sent you up here to die, Wesley said. It was not a question, and she did not treat it as one. He sent me up here to fail, she said. Dying would just be the tidy way it happened. She closed the field book. But my father didn't fail. He got 2/3 of the honest line closed before his heart quit. 41 stations. I have his notes for every one of them. I need 11 more to bring the traverse around the shoulder and close it back to the beginning. 11 stations and a proven closed loop. And Voss can't bury it, because a closed traverse isn't an opinion. It's arithmetic. It closes or it doesn't. And if it closes, every railroad engineer in the territory will know the notch was a lie. She looked up at him, gray eyes steady in the firelight. I have to finish it. And Wesley Crane, who owed nothing to anyone and intended to keep it that way until the day the mountain took him, heard himself say the words that broke a 2-year vow as cleanly as ice breaks underfoot. Not alone, you don't. Not in this country. You'll have your 11 stations. He turned back to the fire so she would not see his face. I know the widow's shoulder better than any man living. I trap it. And I'll not have it said the mountain killed a careful man's daughter, while a man who knew the way sat warm and watched. He did not say the rest of it the true reason, the one he could not yet afford. He told himself it was the debt. He told himself it was justice. He did not tell himself it was the way she had not flinched. They could not move while the storm held, so they waited. And in the waiting, the wary distance between them wore thin. Wesley showed her how he read the mountain, not with instruments, but with 40 years of attention. How the wind laid the snow on a slope to tell you whether it would hold or slide. The sound a cornice made before it broke. The safe hours of the day to cross an avalanche track, and the hours that would kill you. She showed him the instrument because he asked, gruff and almost angry at himself for asking. She set the transit up on his cabin floor and let him put his eye to the telescope, and showed him how the crosshairs split a distant knot in the log wall, how the bubble had to sit dead level, or the whole shot was a lie, how she read the angle off the brass circle to the half-minute. Your father did this on my woodpile, Wesley said, his eye still to the glass, and there was something in his voice she had not heard from him, a kind of grief shaped like wonder. I thought he was just an old man squinting at the hills. He was reading the whole country. He was, she said, and so can I. Wesley straightened from the instrument and looked at her, full on, forgetting for once to turn the burnt side away, and she looked back at the seamed, shining ruin of his face the way she had looked at everything else about that mountain, as a fact, not a fright. "How'd it happen?" she asked, quiet. "Your face." He told her, not all of it and not easily, but he told her sitting on the far side of his own fire with his hands open on his knees, and it was the wound revealed the valley had spent 2 years inventing crueler versions of. He had not been a trapper to start. He had been a younger man with a wife named Margaret and a partner he trusted like a brother, running a powder magazine for a mine on the far side of the divide. There had been an accident, a flash of fire, the magazine going up, and Wesley had been the one who went back into it twice because his partner was inside, and he had carried the man out with his own face burning. And the man he saved had repaid it the following spring by selling Wesley's name to the law for a claim-jumping charge he himself had committed to save his own neck, because that is what some men do with a debt they cannot bear. Wesley had spent 11 months in a territorial jail for another man's crime, and when he came out, his wife was 2 years in the ground of a fever. He had not been there to nurse her through, and the brother he had carried out of the fire was gone west with the money and the lie. "So I came up here," Wesley said, to the fire, not to her, "where a man doesn't owe anybody anything and nobody owes him." And I decided that was enough. The wind moaned in the chimney. Job sighed and resettled against his boots. And Adeline Hartwell, surveyor's daughter, said the truest thing anyone had said to him in 2 years. "That's not enough," she said. "That's just a way to keep from dying. My father had a word for a man who confuses surviving with living. He called it being a hole in the map, a place the survey just goes around." Wesley did not answer, but he did not turn his face away either, and that was an answer of its own. The storm broke on the 5th day, and the broken country it left behind was beautiful and lethal in equal measure. The whole range gone white and silent under a hard blue sky, the snow waist deep in the open and chest deep in the drifts, every slope above them loaded and waiting. Wesley would not let her go up the first day nor the second, because the snow needed to settle and bond, and a survey run across fresh-loaded avalanche ground was a survey run into a grave. He taught her the trapper's patience instead, the discipline of waiting on the mountain's terms, and she taught him the surveyor's, and the 2 patiences turned out to be the same patience wearing different coats. They readied the work like soldiers readying a campaign, and the readying took 3 days, because the mountain does not forgive a party that goes up it short of one thing it needed. Wesley built the sledge from a snowshoe frame and rawhide and 2 staves of split ash, low and long so the instrument would ride level and not pitch into the powder, and he padded the bed of it with a folded elk hide so the brass would not take the cold straight through. He showed her how to lash the case so it would not shift on a side hill. He sharpened the points of the chaining pins and the hub stakes so they would drive into ground, frozen hard as iron. He cut and split 3 days of stovewood and stacked it inside so the cabin would be warm when they came down spent and frozen each night, because a cold cabin at the end of a survey day, he told her, was how you lost fingers and then lost the will. He laid out their food by the day and the meal, jerked elk and hard bread and a twist of tea, and he weighed it in his hands as carefully as she weighed an angle, trusting nothing to guess. And he taught her his half of the work, the half her father had known by instinct and never written in any field book. He taught her to read the loaded slopes above their line, which were settled and bonded and which were a slab waiting on a footfall. The difference between snow that whispered under the shoe and snow that boomed. He taught her the safe hours, the cold blue window after the long freeze of night, and before the sun could come around and soften the slab and bring it down. He taught her never to cross the run out of an avalanche track in the warm of the afternoon, and never to stop and set an instrument in the middle of one, no matter how good the shot. And she listened to him as she had once listened to her father, taking it in whole, because she had learned long ago that the people worth listening to are the ones who have buried someone for not knowing the thing they are trying to teach you. She broke trail with him in the timber to harden her legs to the snowshoes. She practiced setting the transit with her hands deliberately numb by the cold so the day itself would hold no surprise. He broke trail. She carried the field book and the plan in her head, the 11 stations her father had laid out in his notes, the long curving line around the widow's shoulder that would, if her arithmetic was honest, close the traverse and prove the lie. On the third clear morning, before the sun could soften the slopes, they went up into the white together, the scarred man breaking trail through the snow and the surveyor's daughter behind him with her father's transit on the sledge, and the dog ranging ahead, reading the snow for both of them. The survey itself was the hardest work she had ever done, and the most exact. At each station, Wesley would stamp out a level platform in the snow and drive a stake for the hub, and Adeline would set the transit over it and bring the bubble to dead center with hands going numb in the cold, and sight back to the previous station and forward to the next, reading the angles off the brass circle to the half-minute, calling the numbers, writing them in the field book in pencil because ink froze. They measured the distances with a steel chain that bit her palms through her gloves and rang like a struck bell in the cold. It was slow. A single station could take an hour in that cold, with the light short and the temperature falling at sundown to a depth that stopped the breath in the chest, and they could manage only 2 or 3 stations between the hour the snow was safe to cross and the hour the light failed. Wesley watched her work and stopped, somewhere in those days, thinking of her as a thing he was saving. She did not need saving at the instrument. At the instrument, she was the most certain creature he had ever seen. A woman doing in driving wind and failing light, balanced on a stamped platform over a 1,000-foot drop, mathematics that he could not have begun, and getting it right, station after station, because the country and her father had taught her how, and because she would not let the line go uncertain. "Steady," he said once, the second evening, watching her bring the bubble level with frost in her eyelashes and her hands shaking from the cold, and the angle holding true anyway. It was not much. From Wesley Crane it was a coronation. She heard it for what it was, and she did not let it move her hand off the screw, and the bubble sat still, and she read the angle, and the line went on. They fell into a rhythm those days that neither of them named, because naming it would have meant admitting it had become the best part of either of their lives. He woke before the dark broke and built the fire, and boiled the snow for tea, while she checked the previous day's reductions by lamplight, hunting the small errors that hide in tired arithmetic. They went up in the blue cold together and worked the safe hours hard, and came down in the failing light spent to the bone. And at the fire she would spread the field book and carry the day's stations down into numbers, while he dressed the scrapes on her hands without asking, and set the food to warm. And the dog lay between them with his chin on his paws, and the wind walked the ridges overhead. She told him about her father, the things you can only tell a person who will not try to fix them, how he had taught her the stars to pass the long camps, how he had wept exactly once, when her mother died, and never again where she could see, how he had built her the second table. He told her in pieces, dragged out of him a sentence at a time, about the years before the fire, the man he had been, the things he had wanted. They were 2 people who had each decided, for hard reasons, to want nothing, discovering across a brass instrument and a field book that they had each been wrong, and that wanting something again was the most dangerous and the most alive a person could feel. Neither said a word of it. It lived in the steadiness, in his hand always under the sledge on a side hill, in how she had started leaving the burnt side of the fire for him without thinking. So he would not have to choose. They were 8 stations in, 2/3 of her 11, with the traverse curving true around the shoulder, exactly as her father's notes had promised, when the mountain tried to kill them both. It was the 9th station, on a traverse across the head of a wide-loaded slope below a hanging cornice, the most dangerous ground on the whole line, and Wesley had timed their crossing for the cold, safe hours of early morning when the snow was locked hard. But the day before had been warmer than he liked, and the night had not frozen as deep as it should have. And as Adeline stood at the instrument calling an angle, the dog stopped dead in the snow ahead of them, hackles up, and made the sound. The low rumble that meant trouble, that did not know it was trouble yet. Wesley felt it the same instant, the snow underfoot speaking a different language, a deep settling whoomp that traveled out across the slope like a thing waking up. Della, just her name, the first time he had used it, and it was a command and a warning and a prayer in one syllable. Drop it. Run. But she did not drop it. Her father's transit, the 19 years of brass, the proof of the honest line. She would not drop it. She snatched the field book and grabbed the instrument off the hub by its frame, and the slope let go. What came down was not the whole mountain. Wesley would tell her later that if the whole slope had gone, they would both be under it still. But it was enough. A slab of wind-packed snow the size of a barn, breaking loose above them and coming down the track with a sound like the sky tearing. Wesley did the only thing there was time to do. He hit her at a dead run, drove her sideways and down behind the one outcrop of rock on that whole murderous slope, a knuckle of granite barely the size of a wagon, and put his own scarred back to the avalanche and his arms over her head and the instrument both, and the white wall hit them. It buried them to the chest and tried to take them down the mountain and could not, quite, because of the rock and because of the man. And when it had roared past and the terrible silence came back down, Wesley Crane dug them both out of the packed snow with his bare hands. And the first thing he saw when he cleared the snow from her face was that she was alive. And the second thing he saw was that she had the transit clutched to her chest, unbroken, the bubble glass intact. And the third thing he felt, with a force that frightened him more than the slide had, was that he could not have borne it if she had gone down that mountain. She had a broken wrist and he had a wrenched shoulder and a long cut down the burnt side of his face where the rock had opened the old scar. And they were 9 stations into an 11-station traverse with 2 to go and the light already failing, and there was no question of going down. There was never any question of going down. They made it back to the cabin in the blue dark, with Adeline's wrist splinted to a piece of snowshoe frame and the transit on the sledge. And that night, by the fire, the wall between them finally came down, not in a declaration but in the only language they shared, the language of 2 people who have decided to live, which is care delivered as logistics. She could not splint her own wrist or build up the fire or boil the snow with one hand, and so he did it. All of it, without being asked, and she let him, without an argument or a flinch. And somewhere in the doing of it, the debt that had brought them together quietly dissolved. Because you cannot keep a ledger with a person whose blood is on the rock that saved you. "Why didn't you let go of it?" he asked her, low, dressing the cut on his own face by feel in the firelight. "The instrument? You'd have run faster." She looked at the brass case at her feet, scarred and dented now and still true. "Because it's the only thing I have left of him," she said, "and because the line doesn't close without it, and because if I dropped it, Voss wins, and a train full of people dies in the Notch every 3rd winter for the next 100 years, and my father is a liar in the railroad's records forever." Then quieter. "And because you told me to drop it, and I've spent my whole life being told what a woman should let go of." Wesley Crane went still, his hand on his own ruined face. "2 more stations," he said at last. "We'll get your 2 stations." It was the closest thing to a vow he had made to a living soul since the fire. And this time, he didn't tell himself it was the debt. They finished it 3 days later, on a windless morning so cold the snow squeaked underfoot, and the breath froze in the beard he had not shaved, and on the wool scarf she had wound to her chin. Station 10 on the far side of the shoulder, where the widow's slope eased at last into the long, gentle grade her father had sworn was there, the lower way, the honest line. And Adeline set the transit and read the angle one-handed with Wesley, turning the screws under her direction, the 2 of them working the instrument as one person with 3 good hands between them. And then Station 11, the closing station, the one that would bring the traverse all the way around the mountain and back to its beginning, where her father's first hub still stood. She set the instrument. She sighted back along the line they had walked and bled for. She read the final angle, and she wrote it in the field book. And then she sat down in the snow with the book on her knee and her splinted wrist in her lap, and she reduced the whole traverse, every station her father had set, and every station they had set together, all 41 of his and the 11 of theirs. 52 stations carried around a mountain through a killing winter, and she computed the closure. Wesley crouched beside her, not understanding the arithmetic but understanding her face, watching her work the numbers down to the one number that mattered, the gap between where the line ended and where it had begun. If the work was honest, the gap would be almost nothing. If anywhere in 52 stations a single angle had been shaded or a single distance faked, the line would not close, and Voss could call it all a woman's error. The traverse closed to a hair, less than half a foot of error, around an entire mountain, a closure so tight that no railroad engineer in the territory would be able to call it anything but the truth. And the proven line did not go through Voss's notch. It went around the widow's shoulder on the low, honest grade, exactly where Thomas Hartwell had said it would, exactly where he had died trying to prove it. Adeline Hartwell sat in the snow on the roof of the world, with her dead father's vindication closed to half a foot in her own hand, and she did not whoop or weep. She breathed, a long breath out, white in the cold, the first full breath she had drawn since a man in a land office called her a seamstress. And Wesley Crane, watching her, understood that he was looking at the most formidable person he had ever known, and that the valley had laughed her up a mountain to die, and that she had instead carried a dead man's honesty across 52 stations, and a broken wrist and an avalanche, and brought it home closed to half a foot, and that he, the burnt man, the hole in the map, had been let in close enough to watch her do it. "It closes," she said, and looked up at him and smiled for the first time since he had known her. "Wesley, it closes." There remained the matter of the man in the land office and the bringing of the proof down off the mountain, and the world that had to be made to look at it. They came down together when the weather gave them a window, the closed field book and the reduced traverse wrapped in oilcloth inside Adeline's coat against her heart, the dented brass transit on the sledge, the gray dog breaking trail ahead. Wesley came all the way to town, which he had not done but twice a year in 2 years, and he did not turn the burnt side of his face away from the people who stared, because he had stood under an avalanche for the woman walking beside him, and a man who has done that has nothing left to be ashamed of in front of a town. They went to the Cascade and Northern Railways district office, where the chief engineer of the Western Division happened to be in from St. Paul, and they went in past Harlan Voss, who came up out of his chair this time, fast, his face working as he saw the field book in her hand, and the closure she could not have walked down the mountain without. She did not gloat. That is the thing about Adeline Hartwell that the men at the long table never understood and never would. She laid her father's field book on the engineer's desk, open to the reduced traverse and the closure computed in her steady hand, and she said in a voice with no triumph in it at all, only the flat certainty of arithmetic, "The notch route Mr. Voss contracted is a lie. The grade is too steep to pull, and the avalanche track above it will bury a loaded train every third winter. My father knew it and refused to shade the numbers, and it cost him this contract and very nearly his name. This is the honest line. Around the widow's shoulder, on the low grade, 52 stations closed to less than half a foot. You can send your own men up to check it. They'll close it where I closed it, because it's true." And then she stepped back and let the arithmetic do what arithmetic does, which is to stand there being true no matter who is in the room. The chief engineer read the field book. He read it twice. He had pulled enough grades and buried enough men to know exactly what a half-foot closure around a mountain meant, and exactly what the notch grade in those numbers meant. And he looked up at Harlan Voss with an expression that closed the matter more completely than any speech could have. Voss had time to say her name once, and to start to say the word seamstress, and to think better of it with the chief engineer of the Western Division watching him over the open proof of his lie. He did not finish the sentence. He sat back down. He was, from that moment, a man the railroad would quietly stop trusting, and he knew it, and the knowing was the whole of his punishment, and Adeline Hartwell never wasted another word on him as long as she lived. The Cascade and Northern paid the Hartwell estate every dollar of the contract, and then it hired Adeline Hartwell to run the location survey for the line she had proven, the first woman the railroad had ever carried on its books as a surveyor in her own name, because the chief engineer of the Western Division was a practical man, and the most practical thing in the world is to hire the person whose work closes to half a foot around a mountain. The line they eventually built went around the widow's shoulder on the low grade, exactly where she closed it, and in the 100 winters since, no train has ever been buried in the notch, because no train has ever been sent through the notch, because a careful man told the truth, and his daughter carried it down a mountain in the cold and would not let it go. The men at the long table got smaller in the telling, as men like that always do, until they were a footnote in the story of the woman they had laughed up the past to die. And the word seamstress was never again, in that valley, said about Adeline Hartwell, except by people who did not know they were quoting fools. She and Wesley were married in the spring, in the valley, under a sky as hard and blue as the one over the closing station. And if you want to know who stood up with them, it was a gray dog named Job, and an old chief engineer who had become, in his practical way, the nearest thing to family either of them had, and 4 trappers down off the high country who had heard, because the high country hears everything, that the burnt man had stood under an avalanche for a woman and come down to town with his face turned toward people for the first time in 2 years, and had come to see the thing for themselves. Wesley did not leave the mountain, neither did she. They built a second room onto the squared timber cabin above Cutthroat Creek, and a long drafting table under the south window where the light was good. And Adeline Hartwell surveyed the northern range for the railroad for 30 more years. And Wesley Crane trapped his lines and broke her trail, and built her sledges and stamped her platforms in the snow. And the two of them ran more honest country onto more clean paper than any party the Cascade and Northern ever put in the field, because between them they had 3 good hands, and 40 years of the mountain and a closure of half a foot, and a debt that had long ago turned into the other thing. He kept his face turned toward her for the rest of his life. That was the whole of how the wound healed, not that the scar faded, because it never did. but that the one person he could not turn away from had looked at it on a stormy night and seen a fact and not a fright. And after that, the rest of the world's looking stopped having any weight. And she kept the transit. The dented, scarred 19-year brass transit her father had carried for 19 years, and she had carried for 30 more. The bubbles still true. The brass corners worn bright by 3 generations of careful hands, because in the end she taught a daughter of her own to set it level over a hub, the same way her father had taught her, his cold hand over hers on the case above the tree line. The girl had her grandfather's gray eyes. She learned the vernier by the time she was 9. And on the day the railroad opened the line around the widow's shoulder, Adeline Hartwell stood on the low grade with the brass transit on its tripod, and her husband beside her with his scarred face turned toward the sun and not away from it. And she set the bubble level one more time, and she sighted down the honest line her father had died for, and she had closed. And the train came around the shoulder of the mountain on the grade that would never bury anyone, right where the arithmetic said it would. A map only shows you where the world already is. It takes a steady hand, and someone who refuses to let go, to prove there was a way through all along. So, tell me, if you'd stood where Adeline stood, with a falling glass and a laughing room behind you and a brass instrument and a dead man's honest line in your hands, would you have ridden up the pass alone to prove the truth no one would let you tell? Or would you have set the instrument down and walked away from a fight the world had already decided you couldn't win? Stay up here with us at Timberline Hearts, where the scarred and the overlooked turn out to be the only ones with the steady hands, and let me know.